Holy Names for Our Dybbuk is a collaborative performance artwork that I developed while I was living in Poland last year. And I did it in collaboration with a Polish choreographer, Magda Śpisz, not pronouncing her name right, and a crew of Polish dancers. And maybe first I'll dissect the title. So Holy Names comes from a tradition that once existed in Polish lands and across Ashkenaz, Eastern Europe, of Balei Shem, who were these Jewish healers who would go around from shtetl to shtetl with different folk traditions of healing. And one included using the holy names of God, the Shemot, as practices for different protection, for different healing purposes. So I loved starting with this idea that the holy names, in Hebrew there's many, many names for God, Hashem, and that we could use those as part of the healing process. And the basic essence of the performance was that we were to perform a Dybbuk exorcism. And Dybbuks are a Yiddish folklore that were very popular in Poland. Specifically, and there's an artistic lineage of Dybbuk performance in Poland in the 20th century. It's the idea that a soul who is passed has returned to this land to possess a living body because something is unresolved. And I've taken that idea and I've transmuted it because it usually has a pejorative term almost associated with like demon possession. And I started to think, well, Dybbuk is anything that's clinging to you that doesn't feel like it belongs to you, but somehow is in you. And I started to think about ancestral grief, this idea of intergenerational trauma as a kind of Dybbuk that haunts us. And I loved this idea that I could bring that Dybbuk back to Poland and perform it with Polish dancers on sites where there was Jewish death and Jewish genocide. So we designed the first performance for the KL Płaszów, the former concentration and labor camp outside of Krakow. And then the second performance we did here at the Polin. And when I speak of exorcism, I did a lot of research around what historically were forms of Dybbuk exorcism, and there is documentation, probably starting in about the 16th century. Mine is a creative interpretation and very somatic idea of what a Dybbuk exorcism will look like. We used a lot of techniques that come from what's called authentic movement practice in dance, a way of activating your somatic intention or improvisation around what it feels like to be very embodied. And then we also examined how that related to the land itself and what the land is holding, because I was very much thinking about centering the land as the site of the witness, but also, you know, holding the death and holding the trauma. And then we also looked at Yiddish dance in Poland, specifically the choreographer Judith Berg, who was the choreographer and performer of the Dybbuk in the film made in 1936 here. And she had a dance studio in Warsaw, and she had studied with Mary Wigman, who's a well-known German modern dancer. And then she came back to Warsaw and she started combining Yiddish dance with modern dance. And to study her work is really, there's so much learning that can unfold, and to also feel what does it mean to bring back this practice of modern and Yiddish dance combining with other contemporary practices, and to do it in collaboration for me as an American Jew of Polish descent and non-Jewish Poles, you know, at these very loaded sites. And it's been a really incredible experience. I hope there will be more opportunities to perform this. We intentionally designed it to be very adaptable to each site. And there are many other elements to the performance that I can continue to share with you as we talk.
Yes. So could you please describe the performance? How was it performed?
Yeah. At each site, it's different. but generally we invite the audience to enter. We're already there at the site. We're engaging with the site in individual, independent ways. So it's me who's possessed by the Dibuk, and I'm kind of waking up and becoming aware that a Dybbuk is possessing me. And then the dancers are what I call the healers, and they've arrived kind of from this other realm, and they're going to exorcise the Dibuk from my body, from our body, the collective body in the land. And so the arrival period is sort of soft and slow. At the Polin, we had the opportunity to use audio and light, as opposed to at the camp that was outside in a park setting. And so I recorded an interview with my dear friend Jill Spector's Bubby, Paula Spiegler, who was born in Łódź and is a survivor. And she's 100 years old. She lives in Philadelphia. And I recorded her speaking the guided meditation that I had already been using with my performers ahead of the performance, which is based on the three mothers of the Hebrew alphabet, which is a Kabbalistic tradition of Shin, Mem, and Aleph. And they each represent different aspects of the body. And when you meditate on them with sound, they produce different kinds of awareness. It's a somatic kind of meditation. So we had been practicing that ahead of performing, and it was very powerful, and the crew really loved it. So I thought at the Polin, I could invite the audience to join us in those meditations, and that it would be powerful to have this voice who's still very much alive, Mir Zenendo. We are here, you know, who also suffered the losses of the Shoah. And she was amazing to work with, and I think her voice is really resonant. And we're working on a video artwork based on the documentation, and her voice will have a strong component in the video artwork.
Mm-hmm. And how was the audience reception? Were they willing to get involved?
Some were, and I think that's been a learning process for me, is understanding the difference between an American audience and their willingness and excitement to participate versus a Polish audience. I don't have an answer on that yet, but I'm also wearing a mask the whole performance, so it's harder to gauge. But to continue with this question, what's the sort of pathway, the journey of the performance? So there's that sort of entry. Then there's an interview section. So this comes from traditional Dybbuk exorcisms, that the mystics would approach the possessed body and start asking questions. Who is this Dybbuk? And through that question and answer, there's an understanding of what is wrong. Why is the Dybbuk possessing this body? And how can we as healers help exorcise it? In the case of our performance, the healers asked my character questions in English, Polish, and Yiddish. Questions that range from who are you? Are you a woman? Is Yiddish your native tongue? Where do you belong? What is your homeland? What do you think of the word genocide? So we were really also intending to put those words out there for the audience to absorb too. Understanding that these sites, especially the former concentration camp, are very loaded, and just to be there and ask people to absorb and be open to what they're witnessing is a process. And from the interview, we begin the physical kind of somatic journey of the exorcism. And I start to duet with individual dancers, and especially in the Polin, we brought the Dybbuk choreography from the film out because it was so much based here in Warsaw. And that was really exciting because the death dance in the film is just stunning, just beautiful. So we got to reenact that. And then, yeah, these individual engagements, there's a lot of vocalization of grief and feeling that that's a powerful thing for us to channel and for others to witness. It's intentionally very dramatic, But I think there's also for us something very real about that release of grief, of pain. And actually there's a tradition, I know it's the same in Polish tradition, something similar in Yiddish tradition, of women who were hired as professional wailers, right? So we were thinking about those traditions too. And eventually we group back together, and we have this big shaking session where we use shaking as a technique to release and also release the energy from the land. And then at the end of the performance, there's the dancers circle around me, and we really understood this part as the final like goodbye of the dibuk. And we developed a sequence choreography, especially designed an interpretation of Judith Berg's dance, Yiddish dance. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You said a lot about the choreography. Is there some room for improvisation, or is everything?
In all of it, there is. So it's not set. We have like time frames and interactions, but there's a lot of room and invitation for the participants, the dancers, to be very much in their body and responding to the space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And who are the dancers that you worked with?
Yes, it was 5 dancers in Krakow and 3 here.
Yeah, but how do you find them?
How did we find them? Mm-hmm. So Magda, the choreographer, is deep in the dance world in Warsaw and Krakow, and so Magda and I initially we developed a workshop, and it was open to everyone, and we called it Release Your Dybbuk. And we first did a workshop at the JCC Warsaw, and it was really a way to test our research, because we had been developing a lot of playful techniques for working through this idea of a Dybbuk possession. And that went really well, and then we offered some workshops in Krakow. And in Krakow, we offered longer ones, like a weekend. And we did 2 long weekends. We invited people to come. And what's interesting is who came. And, you know, we were very clear that this was from Yiddish folklore, and these were our intentions for the piece. And so everyone who came had a different connection to Jewish folklore and Jewish culture in Poland. And hearing those stories was very powerful. And then it was about kind of the spirit of how they embodied our research and their availability and their connection with each other. It was a lot of play, and I think there was a lot of sense of release in the process. Mm-hmm. And then we selected 5 in Krakow, and when we performed it here, we could only bring 3 just because of budget concerns. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What about costumes? Because the dancers and you're wearing special costumes, and the main element of it is the mask, right, that you're wearing. Can you tell about the costumes, and specifically also about the mask?
Yeah. So the costumes I started developing before I came to Poland. I came to Poland in September 2023 for the year on a Fulbright. I had already been coming to Poland in the summers, and I developed the dibuk costume. Very much my performances originate as costumes because I'm a visual artist, and so I see the thing first and I start drawing. And I started to imagine the mask, and I was thinking about what would it look like to have like an ancestor return, and how could she hold her age in this really deep way. And I had already been doing mask work in Los Angeles, where I took a lot of clowning and mask training. So I was very impressed by what happens when you wear a mask. But I wanted it to be a very like Yiddish mask. And I started drawing it and was looking at different references. And yeah, I worked with a friend to help me make that. Then the costume that I wore was based on really the costume from the dibuk film, which originates from the play. And it was an actual wedding dress that I found. And then the healers are wearing old talisim. So someone had given me like old talises like 50 of them. Because they were just sitting in a closet, and I thought, okay, this is a holy task I'm given to make something from prayer shawls that people really wore. And for this performance, I sewed them together as kind of cloaks, and I started to dye them. I wanted the colors to connect to the landscape, the sky, the earth, the sun, and then I sewed onto them the Hebrew letters that we were using in the meditation, Shin, Aleph, Mem, and also Yud, He. And yeah.
Okay. Now I would like to ask you about maybe coming back to the audience reception.
Yeah.
You said that it was, the experience with the audience was a bit different to what you're used to in US. But I wanted to ask, how did your project in general resonated not only with the audience but also with the curatorial team of Pauline, with other artists shown whose works were shown in the rotating gallery? Did it like reach your expectations? Was there anything that surprised you during this process of showing this performance here? Yeah, I'm asking about that dialogue with those three parties, museum, audience, and other artists.
Yeah, I mean, first I think I'll start by saying just the dialogue between myself and my performers was so deep. And there was one day during rehearsals in Krakow that I led them in a different kind of meditation, and in that meditation I invited in our ancestors to be right behind us. And people were very impacted in a way that I did not expect. And then when they shared their stories of what happened to them during the meditation and then how that influenced their performance, they were stories of, you know, someone's grandfather who was in Auschwitz and someone's grandparents who were deported to Siberia. So I think what's important for me to hear is that this is a shared trauma, and it doesn't just exist with one group of people, and being able to talk about it and the interconnections between them is so important. And then in the first performance in Krakow, it was multi-generational, the people who came, and that was very interesting to see. There were children there absorbing, and there were adults, and some of the people were crying. I didn't know that at the time because I'm wearing a mask, and we now have video documentation to see how people's bodies are reacting. And I was told that some people, when we were shaking, like started shaking too. And for me, that was very much the intention. Like, I would love this collective release. I think, you know, space, there's a whole craft to spatial relations and performance. So how do we get people in a circle? How do we get people to participate? These are challenging questions that with more time I would develop even more. Here, people were completely present. I think it's a serious piece, even though I do bring a lot of comedy to my other work. This is very serious work. So it's a different kind of interaction. Working with the staff here was incredible. Eva especially was just so valuable. There was so much professionalism, and to have access to resources and support, to stage it with an audio element, with lights. This got me very excited to see how I could even grow it further. And also in creating a video artwork from it, there's just really beautiful footage because we had that support for it. I think also doing it in Warsaw, Warszawa in Yiddish is very powerful. So there was just the interaction with the site too. In fact, I was very inspired, and we brought this in slightly. There's a well-known Yiddish poet who wrote in his journal of Warsaw, Warszawa, 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 the word possessed me like dibuk. And I just thought, wow, okay, this place is holding that lineage, that history. How do we engage with it? And that's interesting because knowing that, you know, the Pauline was built on the site of the destroyed Muranov and Jewish ghetto, it's hard to see that in the pristine, clean white walls. So you really have to sink into like a felt sense of space in order to like bring that memory forth. And yeah, there's a little magic in that. There's a lot of like sensory attention. And one thing I'll say that is interesting for me, especially in this performance, is it actually required a lot more spiritual attunement than just the creative attunement. And I realized that that needs a lot of care, particularly after the performance. To be held by community feels very important. And I don't have strong community here. So maybe one thing that would be interesting to share with you is that the way this work is received in my Jewish community in North America is completely different. Now, no one has seen the live performance because I haven't done it there, but I've shown them video footage and I've held these workshops that's connected to the research. And because the majority of this community is Ashkenazi Jewish from Eastern Europe, with many descendants of survivors, they're feeling it in a very impactful, embodied way. And I would say that as an American Jew, I am bringing these certain somatic exercises and practices that are already embedded in a certain kind of American culture, coming from Los Angeles, the West Coast. So also language is a barrier. My Polish, so I can't have as much direct understanding. And I would say that it's my intention to continue those dialogues, to understand more and more. Working so closely with Magda, the choreographer, I learned so much about a Polish perspective, Polish experience on these questions, on this history. And Pauline just elevated that dialogue, allowed me to speak to more audiences, and with the hopes to continue that conversation.
But do you feel that the language barrier is the crucial here, or there is something more there that hinders the reception of your work in Poland?
That's a great question. I think language is just one more element of the cultural barrier. And it feels too early to know. You know, I am really interested, particularly these differences, Jewish community here, North American or Israeli community coming here of descent, of Polish descent, non-Jewish Poles. But maybe I'll give you an example, because Magda, the choreographer, she went through this whole personal process during the performance. She had told me ahead of time the story of her grandmother, who on her deathbed shared that she was Jewish. And that was something Magda learned at an older age, and it really impacted her. And in the invitation to work with me, that was part of her process. So that's also how Jewish is Polish, Polish is Jewish, right? And this kind of shared heritage that's complex and layered. For me, that's tapping into, that's passing the boundary of the disconnect, right? It's a kind of way to, build and cultivate, nourish connections.
So I understand that those personal stories that people you worked with were very important for you to understand the context of each site where you work. But I want to ask specifically about Warsaw. What this process of sinking into history, memory involved? How long it was? How did you make any research before performing here? Yeah. I mean, content-wise, I've been researching for a long time, researching Warsaw. I did a Yiddish immersion in Warsaw this past summer. That really brought the city alive for me in a way that it hadn't been before. I had been coming to Warsaw for a few years, studying Yiddish, being immersed in Yiddish culture in Warsaw. It was like, oh, this is what it was. And then there's a whole nother kind of research that is not text-based, that's not about archival materials.
It's about felt sensation. And I feel it so immediately every time I return to Poland. It's intense. The sense of loss, the sense of a void. And I think that's why so many Jews of Ashkenazi descent around the world come back here, right? There was such a depth of Jewish culture here. And for me, that question of how to, there's a reclaiming, maybe a refilling, revitalizing, reforesting Jewish life here in relation to 1,000 years of Jewish life. For me, that's part of reclaiming Yiddish language and culture, is understanding how it shaped itself by this place, and or this place shaped it. And yeah, what does that mean as a living body to be in that unknown, and to be in it with an understanding of the traps of nostalgia, you know, that memory is imagination. For me, that's huge. Collective memory, it's imagination. So how do we reimagine and remember? And remembering is just as much, forgetting is as much about remembering as remembering. So I like approaching it as an artist. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So I would like to ask you about your personal feelings and physical experience related to the fact that you are the Dybbuk in your performance. How does it feel to be the Dybbuk, and how does it feel during the performance? How do you feel after it ends?
It's an intense experience. We do a lot of preparation ahead of time. We do guided meditations, a lot of physical preparation, obviously, to perform. The mask itself has a lot of power, and it creates a kind of safety for me, and it allows me to go very internal, and it also allows me to access some kind of base level of expression that's no longer about me, like a dissolution of self or ego. We do a lot of preparation. Really, the formation of the performance comes from how we connect as a community, me and the performers and the choreographer. So the care that we bring to each other and the trust that we've built allows the process to really flow when we're in the actual performance, literally holding each other. And I would say that afterwards is a challenge, because we're performing, you know, a creative act, but it has this spiritual, relational aspect to it. It's very ritualistic, but it's still framed as a performance. I wonder if it was framed as a ritual, if there would be a different component, especially at the end, where we're all collectively releasing somehow. And actually, when I do the workshops, it's more oriented towards the participants' release, and I see that element of the project come through more than I do in the performance, because there still is often that divide between performers and audience.
So there were two photographs shown in the rotating gallery as well, not only the performance. So could you talk about these photographs? I know that they are part of your bigger project that you developed under the category of Doikait. Mm-hmm. So could you please say a bit more about this project and this bigger framework within which you work?
Doikait means here-ness in Yiddish, and I got interested in this concept a few years ago when it was introduced to me in Yiddish class. And the idea originates in Poland, actually, in the Bund, which was a Jewish socialist labor movement in Eastern Europe and Russia, Russian Empire in early 20th century. And they framed their political positioning around this idea of diaspora, and that their slogan was, wherever we are, that's our land, or that's our homeland in Yiddish, that line. So I became interested in here-ness in two ways. One, as I've been describing, my performance is really place-based, and this idea of being present. So here-ness, be here now, which is a kind of Ram Dass mantra. And the other component is the historical and political lineage. The Bund also, in its framing, was anti-Zionist, and Poland at the time, early 20th century, it had many Jewish political ideas running through and arguments, and to me that's about the health of the Polish Jewish lineage and community, that there were so many opposing positions. Of course, that idea, Deutschheit, was dramatically shifted with the Shoah. So questions around that also come up. And then for me, whose great-grandparents left Poland in the early 20th century, what does it mean for me to return to these lands and perform these Yiddish folklore characters here? So it's complicated, and I love Deutschheit as this bigger framework. Deutschheit has also returned to North American Jewish community as a political framework for being in solidarity with other marginalized groups. And what does it mean to support one another? And originally the Bund was also about that. It was a Jewish labor movement, but in solidarity with other workers. So all of these layers come in, and I relocated to Poland in September 2023, and a month later, October 7th happened. And I really began to hone in on this question of like, why am I here? What am I doing? What is my purpose? What is this in relationship to America, my home country, to Israel? What I was taught was my ancestral homeland, and then Poland, where my ancestors actually come from in the more immediate sense. And I took my first photograph that I framed here was me dressed as the Dibuk in one of my ancestral cemeteries in Tarnów, where my great-grandmother Mali was from. And the Dibuk is holding a sign that says in Yiddish, wherever we are, that's our homeland. And that idea of the photograph was taken during the winter. It's a very snowy, gray cemetery, and here's this Dibuk character coming back to life in this cemetery, holding that sign. I love the questions that it frames. I cannot give the answers. That would be a boring kind of artwork. And the second photograph I did months later in early spring, and I made this large quilt that was a quote from Deuteronomy, from the Torah, that translates in English as, "Do not stand idly by your neighbor's blood." For me, this was one of many teachings from the Torah that I grounded in relationship to the violence that came from Israeli aggression post-October 7th into Gaza. And to be in Krakow and witness the kind of genocidal violence that I saw from a distance in Gaza while grounding in this immense Jewish genocide and loss really brought up a lot of questions. And as an artist, I channel my questions through visual components. And so I made this quilt, and I'm dressed as the Dibuk, and we took the photo at the old Jewish cemetery of Podgórze, which was outside of Krakow, near the site of where we performed. And I'm laying amongst the gravestones. The matzevot were destroyed by the Germans, by the Nazis, but you can still see some of the gravestones, the cement or stone, and I'm laying there with this blanket covering me. Thou shalt not stand by idly at your neighbor's blood. So, you know, it's speaking to the past, it's speaking to the present, and this is really a question of Torah, of like ethics, of how we behave and how we relate to others and our neighbors. And it's a hard one. I don't mean to reduce anything down or simplify it. My hope is that the work itself provokes these questions internally and allows opportunities to have open conversations.
Mm-hmm. And what comes up from this conversation? What comes out of this conversation?
I think a lot of pain, a lot of grief. Yeah. I mean, my photographs, you know, I'm interested in aesthetics and beauty, so I don't shy away from that. In fact, I embrace it. But in the beauty, there is the pain. It's pretty basic. And I also think that, you know, there's ways of speaking that are nonverbal. So as an artist, I'm interested in that. So it doesn't have to be spoken, the response. You know, I think that people can kind of hold it in them and allow an internal conversation to come forward, and then hopefully, yes, eventually broader conversations. But I don't expect art to be the dialogue itself. It's sort of the provocateur.
So you are not explicit that it is your commentary to the contemporary issues?
I mean, in conversation I am, but I think I want the work to speak for itself. I think however deep people are willing to go. I think also, you know, it's interesting because the sign that the Dibuk holds in the cemetery is in Yiddish, and I don't translate it, and not that many people speak Yiddish, right? So the translation is in the title, but I think that also becomes a kind of like, is this for me as an audience? How much knowledge do I bring to this? Am I missing something? How do I connect? Whereas the other one has it in Hebrew and English translation.
At the same time, you were rather open about your opinion about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I was wondering what was the reception of those statements that you made.
Yeah, I wrote an essay in November 2023 published by Hyperallergic, which is an American arts magazine. And I was really grateful for the opportunity because I felt very much that I had to speak and that I had a unique position being an American Jew in Poland. And in general, the reception has been great. I think people are grateful. I think that I've been doing this research for quite a long time. So there's I'm grateful there's a respect to having my voice heard. And it is amazing to me that people are asking for that voice to emerge more than ever before. So a few years ago, I was writing about Doikite. You know, a small group of people were interested. Now that's like much more common. I hear people talking about it. Even American Jews who aren't that educated about Yiddish culture, they're hungry, they want to know more. And I think people are looking for other ways to connect to ancestry and Jewish tradition and Jewish lineage that doesn't have to do with militarism or nationalism or violence. And of course, violence is a part of history. So I'm grateful to be a connecting point. And that's actually the direction that I see my work going. I'm in no sense an expert, but I am very interested in borrowing from the past these incredible lineages from Yiddish culture, translating them for the present. I'm not a Yiddishist, I'm not a scholar, I'm an artist. So I also am doing that in ways that are embodied, that are sensory, that are nonverbal, that are visual. I incorporate dance and song. And I hope I can bring that alive for people. And specifically, I see that American Jews and Israeli Jews coming back to Poland is often misunderstood as only a journey back into sites of death. And for me, to access the life that is held here and the forests, you know, especially within nature, there's so much life, right? And we understand land goes on. Land witnesses all the violence, but it's still here. And yeah, I can tell you a little bit more about how I'm orienting towards that work.
Yes. You mentioned Israeli Jews. I was wondering if there are any links with Israel currently. If your work has been ever presented there, or is there any interest from the Israeli for artistic community in your work?
Yeah. No. I don't. I have many Israeli friends. I know Israeli curators. I am very involved in Israeli and Palestinian peace and justice work. Artistically, there's an amazing lineage of, let's say, the Dybbuk performance in Israel, and I have studied that. I think this is where I really understand how I'm a diasporic Jew. Like, my perspective also, it's very North American. But there's also a different way that Poland is understood from an Israeli educational experience and an American Jewish experience. So I'm interested in how these diverge, and I have had many Israeli Jews reach out to me about wanting to be involved in my projects because they're oriented towards healing, and I think that there's been a lot of blockage in terms of doing more healing work here.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So now I would like to ask you about your background,
Mm-hmm.
and I know we wanted also to talk about your newest artistic project. So
Mm-hmm.
so I suggest that we talk a little bit about your background as an artist.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to mention the projects that were milestones for you.
Mm-hmm.
Let's not go too much into details, but I feel that if there is anything you would like to mention now that were crucial for your artistic journey. Let's talk about the new project, and then we will move to your ancestry, because that's something that I really want to ask about, and your coming back to your roots in Eastern Europe. Great. So let's start with the background.
Yeah, I was born in Highland Park, Illinois, which is a suburb outside of Chicago. And I grew up in a very big Jewish family and Jewish community. And Yiddish culture was present, but not always named. And I was always an artist from a young age. I went to art school, got my BFA, my MFA, and then started teaching art. I was a painter, though, and it was in the process of teaching painting for many years that I decided to let go of that medium and to start investigating video and performance, because I was interested in it being more accessible and more embodied and more about place. And I moved many different places within the US, and I found myself in Los Angeles, where I lived for the last 10 years. And Jewish themes had come up in my work here and there, but I hadn't addressed Jewish identity too strongly head on, even though it was a huge component of my upbringing. And when Trump rose to presidency the first year, and there became much more explicit forms of public white supremacy and systemic racism and public anti-Semitism and xenophobia against immigrants, I really felt compelled to respond. And I had already been doing activist work within Jewish community around solidarity with immigrants in America, in the US, and also indigenous peoples in Turtle Island is what it's called. And I was also thinking about golems. Golem is a clay creature that the mystics would make to protect threatened Jewish communities, and I thought, what is a golem for today? And after the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, where these white supremacists were openly chanting "Jews will not replace us" and other racist slogans, I felt compelled to dress up as a golem, and I started making these videos for Instagram where I was basically getting revenge on the white supremacists, using kind of Jewish tropes of the blood libel and global domination. So bringing in humor, silent film, and drag. I would say. And they took off. And the theme of the golem is that it supersedes its creator's intention and control. So I let it grow and grow and grow, and that was kind of my entry into Yiddish performance. And from there, I just, completely became absorbed and started studying and realized that I had a lineage of Yiddish performance in my family, and my family, every generation, would perform for each other. It was very amateur performance, except for one aunt who became famous from a Wendy's commercial where she said, "Where's the beef?" It became very famous, but she was like part of this lineage of Yiddish humor and performance that I think I was once a little embarrassed by, and then realized, oh, this is amazing and beautiful. And so that sort of put me on the path of the work that I'm doing now. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what about the projects that were milestones for you?
The Golem became a milestone in many iterations, and maybe like a big milestone was my first museum show at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, and they commissioned a project called Prayer for Burnt Forest. And from there, it was the Golem. Then I started thinking about the Dybbuk. What would I do with the Dybbuk Yiddish folklore? What would it mean to come to Eastern Europe? And then the third character that I perform as is a Sadik, which is like a righteous man. And that's more of a drag king character. And that character is really sweet and funny and brings a lot of humor and can interact with people more because he talks. The Golem never spoke. The Dybbuk doesn't speak. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so what is your newest project? What are you working on now?
Well, I have a combination. So I have this Sadik, I call him the psychedelic Sadik, and he's been leading these collective liberation workshops and other performance projects. And then this newer project, which is more collaborative and place-based, it's called Hearland. And I'm working on this with my collaborator, Daniel Voskoboynik. And this is a project that's inspired by Rabbi Shmuel Aaron Tamaris. So Rabbi Tamaris was living in eastern Poland in a small town, Milichice, near the eastern border with Belarus, in the early 20th century. And he was writing about nonviolence and liberation theology from a Jewish perspective. And he was an early Zionist, and he left the movement, and he wrote really critically and prophetically about the violence that would come when we bring Judaism and nationalism together. And I was introduced to his writings and was very intrigued, and then I reached out to some friends and activists, and they put me in touch with the cultural director of this small town, Milichice, and I visited last summer, and it just so happens that Monica Bayut, who's the cultural director, recently completed the restoration of the synagogue there where Tamaris preached. And
could you repeat the name of this place?
Yeah, I'm not pronouncing it right. Milichice. Very small town. It was once half Jewish, and the synagogue is right in the center of town, and it's been in ruins for decades, and it just is newly completed, renovated, and it's beautiful, and it's empty. And so I'm interested in bringing artists of Jewish descent, of Polish descent, Jewish Polish, to this town, to this synagogue, and also to the surrounding forests, right? Because it's near the Białowieża forest, right? Europe's old growth forest, and to ask these questions around nationalism and Jewish memory and violence and forests, and to really rewild the Jewish imagination, the diasporic imagination, through grounding in Yiddish land, through his texts, through our connection to the forest, and through the creative practices that I've been building as a kind of toolkit for how collaboratively we can build, we can reimagine, and working with local community to develop theater projects, film projects. So I have a big vision of what it can be. We have a big vision. And a lot of it is in connection to reclaiming these voices like Tamaris and what he has to say, and what gets lost over time, and how to re-embody those ideas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And And are you planning on moving to Poland to work on that, or you
So,
do it remotely?
I'll be here in the summers.
Okay.
I'll be here in the summers, yeah.
Because I understand that the feeling of the site is very important for your
Yeah,
projects, right?
absolutely. And so I intend to continue spending my summers here, which also is such a lovely time to be here, right? But I think the contrast of the richness, of the greenness of the land, of the forest, as opposed to, you know, so often in Jewish images, Poland's represented as cold and gray. And then you think, you know, there's a Yiddish film actually in the Polish forest, and again, the vitality, right? Like, how do we have memory be about imagination and life and not just death and violence?
Yes. So now I'd like to talk about your relationship with Poland and your Polish roots. If you could tell us about your family history, about your ancestors that came here, that lived here, when did they leave, and about your reconnection with Poland, because I know it happened at certain moment, but it wasn't the first time you actually came here. You came here also as a teenager. So I would like you to talk about this process of connecting with Poland at different moments of your life.
Yeah, yeah. So all of my great-grandparents and one great-great-grandparents left Eastern Europe between like 1888 and 1905. And they all went to the United States, to Chicago and New York, and they lived throughout. So one side of the family was from the Białystok region, Tiktin, Tykocin, and different shtetls outside of Białystok. And then I traced one great-grandmother from Tarnów. And then I have great-grandparents from Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine.
And can you tell if these were grandparents on your mother's side or father's
Yes,
side?
both. So the Mali, the great-grandmother from Tarnów, was my father's side, my grandmother's mother, and the other side was my maternal grandmother's father. And so I think the idea of the old country was like this mythic notion growing up, but I had relatives who directly came from, you know, the old country, so it felt familiar. And when I was 16, as part of my Zionist Jewish camp that I went to, the summer of the 7th summer of camp, we are supposed to go to Israel for the summer. And before that, you have the option to go to Poland for a week. And actually, at that age, I decided I didn't want to do that trip because it's this very controlled trip of visiting the death camps and then going to Israel. And Israel's like the redemption. And I felt like I'm a teenager. I knew my friends at the time. I did not want to be in that experience of like encountering violence and death as like kind of reckless American teenagers. So I didn't go on that trip at that time, but then after college I did a trip to Israel, and very briefly I stopped in Warsaw, and I actually had a very magical encounter with a woman who I met at the Yiddish Center, and she gave me a tour of Warsaw, and she was an incredible woman, a survivor, spoke many languages, and so that I always held as this magic thing, my brief encounter with Warsaw.
Do you remember her name?
No, and I have asked around, yeah. But I probably could trace it down if I did more archival research, because she was a character. Yeah, and then a few summers ago, I decided I wanted to go to the ancestral towns where I was from. And thankfully, one of my cousins who's in her 90s, who's in Chicago, did all of this family research. She's really an archivist. And so I had everything already written down. There were a few extra things I didn't know from my father's family and was able to track down. And yeah, I went into the ancestral cemeteries. I found my family name in Yiddish, or Hebrew, written on the gravestones. And actually, in a few weeks, my family's going to come and we're going to go back to those sites because it's really powerful. Tiktin, especially Tekochin, I mean, the shul is still there. The synagogue is gorgeous. It's like a 15th century synagogue. So to actually imagine my family prayed there, I mean, it was a very elevating experience.
Have you looked for places where they lived? Did you have
no addresses, just locations. Yeah. Yeah.
And how did it feel to go there the first time you went?
So powerful. I mean, the thing that struck me, I was there in the summer, is how beautiful it was, how pastoral, that shtetl life was about a kind of wild ecology that was living in the forest, living with animals, living, and not in a kind of nostalgic way, just like this is how our relationship to the land was built over 1,000 years. I mean, migratory pathways, I don't think they were in those regions in Poland for more than a few hundred years. But that idea of adaptability and relation with the land and a kind of reciprocal connection, it's very powerful.
And were these Polish roots present in your upbringing in America? Were there any details of daily life that you now can recognize as something coming from here?
Yeah, absolutely, because what I thought of as Jewish food is also Polish food. So to get here and to really realize, potato latkes, pancakes and borscht and dill and the pickles, everything. It's like the sensorial experience of eating is from here. And I think the more I learned Yiddish language and culture, the more I understand that was the lineage my grandparents' generation was carrying, and that also came from here and adapted in the U.S., but yeah, very strong. Also, I grew up in Chicago area, which has a huge Polish diaspora, so I was always in connection with non-Jewish Poles in Chicago. Yeah.
And can you tell a bit more about your upbringing? Did you grow up in a traditional Jewish family, or how did you cultivate the Jewish tradition?
Yeah, so in the United States, there's a little bit more space between Reformed and Orthodoxy, so I would say my family was more in the middle, moving towards traditional. I grew up in the conservative Jewish movement, was bat mitzvah, very egalitarian. That's a huge difference from Orthodoxy. My grandfather was a very religious man, and my grandparents held Shabbat dinner every Friday. We all had to go. There was no question. I'm so grateful for that experience. Every Friday, Shabbos dinner, lighting the candles. All my cousins, aunts and uncle, all live close by on my mother's side. And all of the holidays. And really, I learned so much from just being near my grandfather in shul, his prayer, his sense of piousness, his sense of family and tradition, and my grandmother, of course. And I'm so grateful for those teachings and that they were available to me. I didn't feel as a woman that that there was something separate. And then as I was exposed to more Jewish traditions, I had moments of becoming really interested in Hasidism. And I think the Baal Shem Tov and Rebbe Nachman, these certain characters that were really about channeling God in a relationship to Hashem through ecstatic state, through dance, through song, a very kind of populist movement, right, that emerged out of Polish lands. And I was very connected to that and excited by that. Also understood in those communities like Chabad or other ultra-Orthodox groups that there was a separation, that as a woman I wouldn't have access. I've now at this age come to understand where I fit, but I want to add that something that has been really incredible for me while living in Poland is witnessing the Hasidic communities come through and understanding that there is a kind of spiritual energy that they are preserving in Poland. And whatever the politics or disagreements I might carry around gender roles, that put aside, I got to witness a pilgrimage to Lezhensk for Rebbe Elimelech or Lag BaOmer in Krakow last year, and really just incredible, and in that I understand that they're also tapping into the spiritual presence of the energy that was once held here, so in such a sacred way.
Yeah, so I want to ask you about actually about the part of your participation in the Jewish tradition here in Poland. But I would like to go back for a moment to your family. So those Shabbat dinner, they were at your on which side of the family?
My mother's side. Yeah.
And your father's side was
not as religious at all. Yeah. Yeah, and I spent more time. I really grew up with my mother's side.
And what language were they speaking? Were you speaking
English, yeah. Well, Yiddish thrown in, but English was their main language.
But were your grandparents speaking Yiddish?
They understood Yiddish, and my grandfather spoke Yiddish fluently, but, you know, the whole thing is they only speak Yiddish when they don't want the kids to hear. But there were a lot of Yiddish phrases, and when my grandfather was dying, he was mainly speaking in Yiddish and singing in Yiddish, and that was obviously the native tongue of his parents.
So these were your great-grandparents that emigrated,
exactly.
Right? And so the grandparents were born, of course, already.
Yep, all in America.
In America, where exactly? In which city?
In New York and Chicago.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I wanted to also ask about the Yiddish performances. What kind of performances? Was that like singing? And
yeah,
what
Yiddish.
That happened in your
family
circle, yeah.
Well, we have great documentation, these fantastic photos. Growing up, what we would have is during holidays or family gatherings, there were like talent shows, and we would perform for each other. And every year, like the same uncle would perform a striptease, or sometimes they would perform in drag. And I have photos of my grandfather dressed up as a woman. Like, this was normal performance that they would do for each other. And when I came to understand how exceptional and rare it was, I understood that there's so much joy and celebration in the transformation of character in my family and the performance of it. And there was also singing. My grandfather was a big singer. One of his sisters was a big singer. So, and yeah, kind of movement, dance. I grew up with a lot of Jewish dance, and those were the main aspects. I think then I started to trace that this like lineage of Yiddish performance comes originally from the Purim spiel, and then kind of moving from back forwards. Yeah, Yiddish theater and studying Yiddish theater, specifically like set design and costumes, and just understanding like the life, the vitality that was brought to these works.
And you went to Jewish schools?
I went to public school, but I went to religious overnight camp, and I went to Hebrew school.
Okay. And are there any significant people that were really important for your for shaping your Jewish identity?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I would say my grandfather Arthur Rubinoff and my grandmother Hortense Rubinoff, very much so. And then I had the opportunity to go to this religious overnight camp, Camp Ramah in Wisconsin, and there were many teachers I encountered there, especially when I started being introduced to like Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah at like age 13. I mean, this was like openings and openings for what was to come.
And so, talking about your identity, I wonder how do you feel today? Do you feel like an American Jew or Polish American?
Good question.
Jew? Like, do you have it specified? Or,
yeah.
And is there any process that you can trace with your identity, feeling of your identity?
I mean, I think identity is very mutable, right? It's always changing, and it's relational. Where am I? Who am I in relation with? There's no question. I feel my Jewishness all the time. It sometimes feels like I can't get out of it. Sometimes it feels like I wholly want to embody it. I understand my American privilege, my privilege as a white American, what that passport allows. I also understand the gratitude I have that my ancestors fled when they did and landed in North America and were able to find and build a home there. But I also embrace the diasporic aspect of being a Jew, and especially now living in Europe, there's just that quality Of course, it comes from the privilege of having an American citizenship, but that I can move back and forth and I can come here and feel connected to this land, even though it was 3 generations removed, and understand so much of my lineage and tradition is grounded here, comes from here, and that feels very powerful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So yes, you live in you're living in Europe. You lived in Krakow, in Warsaw a bit. Now you're based in Berlin. What are your links with the Jewish life in those places, and how did you feel participating in any events?
Yeah.
If you did.
It's dynamic. It's dynamic because, of course, in North America, there's an abundance of Jewish life, and it's more diverse because it's stronger. There's more people and more cultural, different kinds of encounters happening. Here, it's not, you can't take it for granted, right? The Jewish life is smaller, and so whatever's here, if you want to engage, you have less selection, but that also means you're encountering different kinds of Jews and different lineages and different positions politically. Warsaw has a vibrant life, and I found that especially through the JCC, and it's complicated. The questions that Jews ask here are so different. I mean, this question of authenticity that feels really important. I've heard it from a lot of Polish Jews. Am I Jewish enough? I only have this one grandparent. Halakha says I'm not Jewish. All of these questions. Like, in my progressive Jewish community in the U.S., it's not an issue, you know. So I carry that with sorrow. Like I feel sadness that is part of the history and part of how people ask those questions of Jewishness here. In Berlin, where I'm currently based, it's different because there's a big expat community, international community, Jews from all over, and then of course we're sitting in the crux of the center of a Nazi history, and a whole nother ball of wax to unveil around, you know, contemporary German politics and Jewishness, which I won't get into now, but yeah, definitely puts it into perspective, a new perspective.
And can you tell something about your experience as a Jewish woman living in Berlin currently, in the current political situation, and also with the aftermath of October 7?
Yeah, I mean, Germany has a complicated response because the reason of state is to support Israel, and I understand that they see that as a form of reparations. And any critique of Israel and any solidarity with Palestinians is considered anti-Semitic. This is really problematic. And as a Jew who's very critical of Israel and Israeli military and government, to be framed as anti-Semitic, like, I love being Jewish. I am Jewish. Like, I can't have a white non-Jewish German tell me that. But I can, because that's acceptable in German culture right now. And I think that really reveals this question of memory culture and how do we really learn from memory. And if the story there is that the Jew is the eternal victim, then we haven't learned anything. And if the Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism that exists so strongly in Germany is not understood within the context of anti-Semitism, what I see is a lot of replication of the behavior of Nazi Germany and its attitude towards the Jews being replicated in its attitude towards Muslims and Palestinians and Arabs in Germany. So that's hard. But the hope is that I feel a lot of solidarity work, and I understand I have a privileged position as an American Jew to speak out and to be in solidarity with my Palestinian and Israeli friends who disagree with the violence in the land and the German government's position on it. Yeah.